Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Very glad to welcome you in this panel. Those of you who do not understand French are invited to use headphones, because I'm afraid that I will continue in my native language. You don't have headphones. Le professeur Solly Ozel et moi-même,
Professor Solly Ozel and myself will be asking questions through this session to our distinguished panelists. I do think that they are good representatives of our diverse world. I'm sure you are all familiar with our topic today. We are going through Trump's era. Solly and myself have led a series at the Montaigne Institute on this topic, so of course we are compelled to be talking about middle powers against the current backdrop. Most of them are dominated by Trumpism, although it might be much more complex than this, but this is the dominating factor at play. And secondly, we should be as operational as possible at the Paris Peace Forum, and we should bear in mind one thing, one question. Can middle powers reorganize themselves, cooperate better? How? In what fashion? So these were some introductory remarks, and I will now ask Solly to ask the very first question to our very first panelist.
Good morning. Welcome all. I will not speak in my native language. You will not get a translation. Our first speaker is going to be from the rising power of Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, Mr. Dino Patti Djalal. And our question to him is the following. As a major proponent of a social role for middle powers, you have invested considerable time and intellectual energy in situating them in this new Trumpian world, if you will, or in a world where there is a transition, the end of which is yet unknown to many, maybe to all. How do you see the opportunities and the agenda for such a role for middle powers in current circumstances? Which format and which agenda are being shaped? And how would you position Indonesia in all of that? Because we have, in another series of interviews, found out that in your neighborhood, you loom pretty large as a country.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Michelle and Solly, for inviting me to speak here. Let me just begin with a context of the importance of middle powers. The 20th century was significant because the political map changed. At the end of World War II, the UN, the United Nations, had about 50 or so countries. At the end of the century, it became 198 or something, all members of the United Nations. So it quadrupled, from 50 to 200 in the 20th century. In the 21st century, that's not going to happen. There's not going to be quadrupling in the quantity of countries. It's going to remain more or less the same. Hopefully, Palestine will be added to that number. But what will change is the distribution of power, right? In 1945, you had one or two superpowers, well, after that, United States and Soviet Union. Almost no middle powers, right? Very few, but now I would count about 24 middle powers in the north and the south. And what I mean by middle powers, let's just be clear about the definition. If you think about boxing, there's heavyweight and there's middleweight, right? So middle powers are countries that have middleweight capacity in economic, diplomatic, military, technological terms, right? So by this definition, you would have Indonesia, you have Korea, you have Nigeria, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, and so on and so on. So the number is around roughly 24. I think it will be adding to 36 countries. Yeah, and this is changing the texture and the essence of the world system. We know, and I agree with the premise that the world order is undergoing transition into something else. And what that something else remains to be discovered. And in fact, I noticed yesterday a lot of questions, a lot of leaders complain about the world order, but when they were asked what should it be next, yeah, hardly any answer, right? So my point would be, while in the West, I notice there's a lot of attention on China in the next world order. China is this, China is that, China is going to be the biggest power, this and that. But they're missing the role of these 24 middle powers in the North and Global South. And I would argue that the next world order will be shaped not just by the West and by China, but by how these 24 middle powers grow and reshape the distribution of power in the world system. And one way that the middle powers would be relevant is this. When we talk about the world order, you can define it in many ways, but the world order is the sum of regional orders as well, right? What I mean, if when the regions change, the world order change, right? After World War II, Europe was in shambles, right? It was just destroyed, right? But then Europe got together and became a holistic, strategic, economic, and political unit, and that changed the world, right? And what has happened now, Southeast Asia is really changing dramatically, geopolitically. Now ASEAN has engulfed the whole of Southeast Asia, and and I'm quite proud to see this for my region. In Southeast Asia, we used to be divided. We used to be a cockpit for great power rivalries, a lot of proxy wars, and so on. But now, no matter what happens in the rest of the world, the United States, China, Japan, Russia, they all have to knock on our door and seek our permission to engage in our region on terms dictated and formed by regional countries, by Southeast Asia, right? So world order is changing because the regional orders are changing, and middle powers are at the heart of how regional orders are changing.
Merci beaucoup, Dino.
Thank you very much, Dino. I think that this was a great way to set the context. Let's now turn to Dubai. Dubai comes from the United Arab Emirates. The Gulf countries are quite typical of what we can call middle powers. They play an important role, especially against the current backdrop in the Israel and Palestine conflict. And President Trump used this to his advantage. Are you contemplating a growing role for your country? Are there any internal divisions in other countries in the region? How do you see the position of the Gulf countries against the backdrop mentioned by Dino?
Thank you so much once again for inviting me and involving me in this very important discussion. I think when we speak of today's Middle East's political scene, we're no longer describing a geography that was once shaped as much by the Levant or the Maghreb. The center of policy gravity is increasingly and decisively shifting towards Gulf capitals. And this is where we see regional diplomacy being redefined and where mediation is taking place, not just within the context of regional mediation dialogues, but also, interestingly, a few months ago, as it also relates to Ukraine talks in Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, the Gulf has moved from the margins of Arab politics to really a bit of a more central center, and that, of course, has geopolitical implications that are still yet to be fully realized on the ground. In many ways, and against the backdrops of the past recent years, the Gulf has also become the region's, in many ways, first responder for diplomatic convenings, and increasingly playing a role in trying to diffuse tensions and advance a bit of a more political stabilization role where it can. The shift, however, is not accidental. It stems from a realization that Gulf agency must be rebuilt from within the region itself and no longer fully outsourced to traditional guardians of security, particularly in the Trump era. I will say the sustainability of this renewed role will also depend on how the Gulf can maintain its political coherence while managing growing global entanglements, to put it mildly. I think this renewed assertiveness is built on strategic confidence. I think Gulf states, including Saudi, UAE, Qatar, have shown that it's possible to maintain close foreign policy and security ties with the West while still balancing and deepening its economic relations with China and Asia more broadly. I think this balancing act is not transactional per se, it's structural, and it reflects really a new reality of agency rather than full alignment is what will define the coming era. I would say it's also important to not think of the GCC, so members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Oman, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait. It's not a monolith. Gulf states share an instinct for collective stability and state building, but each pursues it through a very distinct political grammar. So Saudi Arabia's focus on Vision 2030, a bit of a kind of domestic inward-looking approach, UAE's more different sort of pragmatic balancing of its relations with world powers, Qatar's indispensable mediation diplomacy, particularly in recent months. These all point to very different domestic priorities and realities. So it makes a singular Gulf voice very difficult to promote, but it doesn't kind of preclude shared strategy, especially on matters of collective security. The war in Gaza has made this even clearer, forcing Gulf states to look beyond, I would say, superficial economic differences among them as states and focus really on confidence-building measures for advancing more homegrown collective security paradigms. It also revealed a lot of the limitations of relying on external security guarantees. So the conflict reignited old regional cracks, but it also underscored a new reality that Gulf states can no longer afford to pin their stabilities on calculations of distant capitals. So Washington will always remain a central partner, but the days of viewing the US as the singular guarantor of security are long over. And I think this sense extends also to current debates we've heard at the forum over the past 2 days, particularly also as it relates to the US role in NATO, in Ukraine and beyond. So there is a shared sense of navigating what a post-US world order looks like for security guarantees. I think this is why also in recent months we've seen a pivot toward intra-Gulf dialogue and regional de-escalation at a pace that we haven't really seen, before, whether it's the UAE's mediation efforts, but also Saudi Arabia's rapprochement with Iran under Chinese auspices was interesting to note. Qatar's role in facilitating the ceasefires. They all represent, I wouldn't say a shift that will happen overnight, but the foundations or the seeds for a new doctrine of self-management are increasingly being highlighted. I also think it's interesting that the Gulf's convening power has also been quite notable in recent years, and in a way that I think is not just a matter of prestige of hosting global events, but of underscoring a new reality that the Gulf remains one of the few remaining geographies that can host both global North and South, and we can debate that naming later on. But really, it's a place where all regions can come together and sit across the same table without the tensions of, or the baggage, I would say, of different uneven balancing historically between the regions, whether that's in COP28 with the UAE, whether that's with the Future Investment Forum a few days ago with Riyadh, but also mediation, the World Cup. This all points out to a very different, renewed confidence in the Gulf that wasn't there a few years ago. So I think, in a sense, when we speak about a collective Gulf outlook, it's really a coalition of strategic interests, particularly on collective security, rather than a complete exclusion from the rest of the Middle East. But it is a very renewed confidence that I think will hopefully create what we discussed last night actually, which is how can the global South have or engage in alternative multilateralism that is more inclusive of its roles, and we do see the Gulf sitting at the heart of that conversation.
We move continents. We move to the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Campos, your country has been one of the very few, in fact, rare examples that actually stood up to Mr. Trump. Yes, you paid a price, but I understand that in Malaysia, the relation between your president and the American president was cordial. Maybe that tells us something about whom he respects too. Anyway, there are two sets of questions, of course, related to Brazil's role in this new world. One is, Brazil is a founding member of the BRICS, and it does, of course, that reflects the aspirations for a non-Western design world order. But BRICS have a lot of conflicts of interest among the members, especially the founding members. So how does Brazil wish to shape its relations with the US, and in which direction would it want BRICS to move? Is it concerned that there might be clashes with the other founding members, China and Russia? But I would add, you're not prepared for it, but it appears that the United States is very interested in, it's not a revision, but an updating of the Monroe Doctrine. How does a country like Brazil respond to that? Thank you.
A lot of questions in 5 minutes.
Yeah, no,
That's what the Brazilians are known for.
I split your question in 3 or 4. So, the role of Brazil in BRICS. No? Brazil is really proud to be founding member of BRICS, and a group that best reflects the aspiration for more inclusive. No? Okay. And representative world. One that mirrors the political and economic realities of our times. I think it's very important to say what this BRIC is about. You know? We're living through a moment of profound transformation in the international system. The old vision, as you said, among the great powers no longer explain the complex dynamic of today's world. Global stability increasingly depends on middle powers, nations that, while not hegemonic, exert a significant influence through diplomatic, economy, culture, and multilateral cooperation. These countries serve as a mediator, stabilizers, and bridge between the developed and developing countries. I think this kind of country like Brazil, we understand the poor country and the rich country. So it's nice to be in this role. For Brazil, BRICS is not about constructing a non-Western order. It's about building a more balanced and inclusive global order on that recognize diversity, multipolarity in the 21st century. Brazil believes the BRICS, because of the relevance of its member, has a unique responsibility and opportunity to contribute for global governance that is more equitable, more representative, and more responsive to the challenge we collectively face. Let us remember that Brazil is founding member of the United Nations and active participant in key agencies, FAO, WHO, UNESCO, and so forth. And also we have a lot of forums in South America, Latin America, and North America. In short, Brazil participates fully in the existing international order, but is also advocating reforms. We seek BRICS that is balanced and cooperative, focusing on economic growth, inclusive governance, and global stability, not on rivalry or confrontation. Talk about internal difference with BRICS that you pointed out. It is true that BRICS brings together countries with different political systems, economic priorities, and strategic interests. For example, China seeks to expand its global influence. Russia views the group as a way of preservative diplomatic relevance or to be more active in the world. India values multilateralism and balance between the West and global South. Brazil pursues autonomy and equilibrium, maintaining a constructive relation with both the United States and Europe. South Africa, along with other members such as Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, contribute distinct regional perspective and energy agendas. These differences do not weaken BRICS. On the contrary, they highlight its plurality and flexibility, qualities that allow the group to act as a political forum for dialogue rather than a rigid alliance. Regarding relations with the United States that you pointed out, the U.S. remains a fundamental part of Brazil. In trade, they are the third most important trade partner of Brazil, investment and technology. Our bilateral relations span more than 22 centuries, built on dialogue and mutual respect. Nowadays, we have some kind of discussion about trade, tariffs, but Lula is doing quite well. So I think we are going to solve this problem. But I think this is normal. Our interests, their interests, so we have to discuss the best. At the same time, Brazil seeks to preserve strategic flexibility, engage positively with major global players. We see our role as the bridge between North and South, promoting understanding rather than polarization. Regarding possible divergence with China and Russia, Brazil is fully aware that there are differences in perspective with China and Russia regarding the future of the global order. Yet, we do not view this as a source of conflict. Our foreign policy tradition is pragmatic, independent, and conciliatory. We maintain good relations with all major actors, including the United States, the European Union, and the BRICS partners. The United States promotes a liberal international order rooted in democratic values and multinational institutions. China and Russia, on the other hand, emphasize sovereignty and multipolar world with less Western dominance. Brazil stands somewhere in between. We support multipolarity, but we also defend democracy, and existing institutions provide they evolve to reflect today's realities. So, in summary, within BRICS, Brazil advocates for reform of global governance and stronger voice for the global South. We recommend the Russian invasion. We condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the United Nations, but we have to also refrain from automatic alignment with sanctions or military blocs. We continue to deepen cooperation with China in trade, technology, and sustainable development. We are advancing to the Mercosur-European Union agreement, which we consider strategic for global balance. And we continue to value the United States as a vital partner for commerce, investment, and innovation. For Brazil, peace cannot be imposed by force. It must be built through trust, dialogue, and cooperation. That is the spirit with which Brazil engaged in BRICS, with the United States, Europe, Africa, and so on. So our goal is not confrontation, but balance, not isolation, but inclusion. And above all, a world where diversity becomes a source of strength, not division. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, nous allons nous tourner vers Galip.
Thank you. We will now give the floor to Galip, our colleague coming from Turkey. Galip, we may have a simple question to ask. And it was predictable we were going to ask it. Maybe it's a tough question, and I haven't asked it before. My simple question is, Turkey is going to play a key role in the next steps of the Israel-Gaza agreement. What do you think this role should be? Do you think there will be barriers and obstacles? This is a tough question. You're not forced to directly answer. Obviously, we'll talk about it later on. Turkey is a typical middle power due to its size, its regional influence, and for so many more reasons. Does Turkey contribute to global governance? And does Turkey have precise ideas on global governance? That is a question for many middle powers, of course.
Well, thank you very much. Let me try to combine all of them in 5-6 minutes, and I'm sure it will be a very easy task. Actually, on the one hand, these are quite interconnected, because there is nowhere to analyze the changing nature of the global order than by looking at the regional conflicts, how they are playing out and how they are being dealt, including when it comes to mediation. And I think one particular thing about including for Turkey, for today's middle powers, so to speak, this term is sometimes contested, but nevertheless, let's use the middle powers. One difference between today's and historical experiences, let's say the idea of the global south was quite popular right after the decolonization process. The actors back then, the one that met, let's say the iconic meetings in Bandung, they were more concerned about the nature of the global order. But today's middle powers are more concerned about the nature of their regional order. And I think that's very important difference. And they look at the global orders through the regional lenses. So in a sense, they look at the regional lens or the regional crisis as a microcosm of the structural change in the global order. For Turkey, that was Syria. No crisis has shaped Turkey's view of the global order and the view of its relation, its idea of partners, alliances, relation with the major powers. No crisis has informed all these elements as much as the Syrian crisis did. The Syrian crisis led Turkey how to read the global restructuring. It led Turkey how to perceive the U.S., how to perceive the Russia, how to perceive the regional actors. From various, if I touch it in a very minor way, the Turkish takeaway, maybe some of them has been recently refuted, but the Turkish takeaway from the Syrian crisis was that the U.S. is unreliable, but also downsizing its regional commitment. The Russia is more predictable and increasing its regional footprint. And there is threat perception, there is the diversification or the decoupling between Turkey and the U.S. threat perception, and that will inform Turkey's approach to actors, etc., and both the global and regional powers at the same time. Yes, some of these parts has been refuted because the Russia's footprint is decreasing on many levels. The U.S. also, we saw when it wants to assert and insert itself, it does it in a massive way. But nevertheless, that was the reading that informed Turkey's approach to the global regional powers at the same time. Without Syria, we would not have seen Turkey buying the Russian S-400. Without Russian S-400, the Turkey-US crisis would not have deepened as much as we are seeing currently, Turkey being removed from F-35. So in a sense, it was Syria that was the microcosm of the global restructuring, and based on this assumption, Turkey acted elsewhere. And the central things here is I would say, and also it's relevant for today, is the changing nature, but the paradox of the U.S. role and how you relate it. I think recently we saw two things at the same time, two contradictory things. The U.S. is both indispensable and unreliable at the same time. It is indispensable. Look at the Gaza, look at the Ukraine. No actor is even coming closer to play the role that the U.S. is playing. So it is the actor. It is the one that can bring Netanyahu to the table. It is the one that can shove the things down the throat of the actors that might not want to do it. So in this regard, it is indispensable. But it is also increasingly and incredibly unreliable. What does U.S. security guarantee means if Israel can attack Qatar, which has the largest U.S. base in the region, which is one of the closest U.S. partner, which is negotiating the Hamas-Israel negotiation at the request of the US with the approval of Israel. So what does it mean, US security guarantees, if this is the case? But what will come from this? I think, again, you will see the two contradictory terms that will come through this. One of them is, in the short term, you have to double down on your relation with the US. On the long term, mid-term, you have to diversify your relations away from the US. And this is exactly what we are seeing happening. Like after the attack, what we saw, the first thing, the Gulf countries, they doubled down on the relation with the US, not reducing it. Qatar went for a stronger defense pact. Saudi Arabia wants to negotiate a similar one. There was including in Turkey as well, there was previously interest in BRICS, etc. All of a sudden you see the appetite for the BRICS is fizzling down for Turkey, for Saudi Arabia, etc. because that Trump would not like it. So in the short term, you don't want to make Trump unhappy, and you double down on your relation with U.S. I mean, obviously, not making Trump unhappy. I spoke more the analytical part, but more realistic part is you have to bribe him more, whatever you call it, be it bribing, use it the larger term, be it buying more the U.S. weapon, be buying making more real estate development project, etc. Whatever you can call it. I mean, there's always many ways, but this is more or less what's happening. But on the mid to long term, what I see is the actors will go for diversification. That doesn't mean giving up on US. They will still US will still remain one of the central actors. But while they were doubling down on the US, but they were also
you would say more diversity rather than more strategic autonomy, as we say in France.
I will bring autonomy under it, because this is no actors. I think the autonomy, all of them as a quest, as an aspiration is there, but also the realistic of it, how much can it be achieved is another question. So we also saw this trend at the same time, while there was doubling down on having stronger relation with the US, but they also signed a deal with Pakistan, another let's say a middle powers. They were also, now we are seeing it has not morphed into anything new, but more at least talk about Turkey and the Gulf Arab states, cooperation in defense, industry, etc. I mean, it was interesting that for the first time Egypt and Turkey undertook drilling in Mediterranean, given also how much they were. I mean, does that mean anything big? No, at this it doesn't mean anything big. But I think this is part of the search. So what I see, there is while this diversification, meaning the different sources of weapons, because what you saw is the following: if the nature of threat is Israel in the region, the U.S. equipment or the U.S. things or politically U.S. is unreliable. So, and therefore you have to diversify. But while diversifying, you cannot make antagonist U.S. What you can do, you can go for the countries that will not lead a U.S. backlash, meaning buying from the Europeans. I think there is more opportunities for European defense industry right now in the region, because now going to buying from China will attract the U.S. punishment or U.S. reaction. Buying from Russia can attract it, and no country in the region wants to do this. I think what they can do, in a sense, go buy from the countries that might not lead to the U.S. reaction. And the final point, this is also the case for Turkey, and I will come to also conclude with a few points on Gaza and Syria. The quest for status, the quest for security, the quest for autonomy, the quest for agency, role, I mean, you name it, are these are some of the central terms that you hear whenever you have a discussion about the middle powers and region powers. But these terms are not static. Their meanings are not static. So they don't mean the same thing all the time. These are dynamic terms and changes with the context, etc. Let me, talk about Turkey. The Turkey's idea of its regional role or agency has dramatically changed several times in the last 2 or 3 decades. prior to the Arab Spring, Turkey focused on the idea of building up a regional order that is premised on good relation with the regional elites, that is premised on the a gradual strategy that means more and more regional economic and social integration. We saw this through the different schemes like, the Levant Free Trade Agreement area that Turkey signed with Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and we saw this also with Israel, the Turkey and Israel also prior to this, like forming a closer relation, particularly up until 2009. I mean, people forget that the Israeli prime minister used to address the Turkish parliament before going to Annapolis in 2007, and then speaking to a packed audience at a Turkish university with very little security in 2007, and the Turkish president driving him around. So there was and the Turkey negotiating between Israel and Syria the normalization. So this was prior to Arab Spring. Then during the Arab Spring, the idea that there is a massive regional transformation and a regional order that is emerging, and that Turkey should be the leading it. And that put Turkey in basically conflict with almost all the Arab states, apart from Qatar and others. That also, particularly after the Syria, it put Turkey and US in a very big crisis over the Syria. Back then, the Turkey's idea of its status, autonomy, role was asserting in opposition to many Arab states, like being Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., but also in a very crisis-ridden relationship with the US. Now what you see is actually this is changing. Now Turkey seeks a regional role in cooperation with the Arab states and in cooperation with the US. Like 2 years ago, Turkey would have seen the US presence in Syria as problem. Now it sees this as an opportunity, actually, as a constraint on Israel. And the final point on Gaza, I think right now the military side of it, that was the key one, whether the Turkey will have a military role or not. The Israel is opposing it. The US still, at least tentatively, was committed to it. So whether it will happen or not, that will be the essential question, because if it does happen, I think the Israeli discontent with the Turkish-Israeli discontent will grow, because the Turkey is in Syria and in Gaza, etc., probably will add. At the same time that Turkey sees now Israel for the first time through the nation's security threat. And I think that will, to some extent, will constrain maybe the Turkish role in Gaza, but Turkey will be a key actor when it comes to the Hamas transformation with Qatar, with Egypt, etc., and the discussion on the new political groupings in Palestine.
Thank you, Galip. If we have time, I'll ask you anyway. Why you would reduce Turkey, its regional impact, just to the Middle East.
Just to explain one.
But now we move again to the Pacific. And Japan, of course, is a critical partner of the United States. You now have a new prime minister, a first for your country. I suppose you rejoice in her choice. And she seems to have studied Mr. Trump very well. I mean, from Galip's presentation, we should all be looking forward to either Mar-a-Lago clones or Trump towers and golf courses in our countries, as the two brothers are circling the world to actually sign deals. How does Japan view the strategic environment in East Asia? First of all, there are more countries in East Asia, in the Pacific region, that are courted by the United States. We've seen the rise of Indonesia, which was, of course, a major instigator or initiator of the non-aligned movement back in the Cold War days. Does Japan see the situation in East Asia in terms of uncertainties that American unreliability create? Is Japan interested in pursuing a web of alliances with other Asian countries while keeping the American connection alive, just the way Galip described for the Gulf region? And how does Europe figure out, if at all, in such a vision? After all, in terms of the systemic West, Japan is also partners with Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. It is a great honor to join this important discussion today. I believe everyone would agree that Japan is one of the most typical example of the middle power, a country that is on trust, rules and law, cooperation rather than sea power. Japan's diplomacy has long valued stability through trust than power. For us, being a middle power does not mean balancing great powers. It means keeping cooperation and offering practical wisdom to stabilize the world. Japan's vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, so-called HOIP, originally proposed by the late Prime Minister Abe, reflects this philosophy. It's not limited to Asia, but aims to connect like-minded partners across the region, from Asia to Europe and Africa, through trust, transparency, and connectivity. It promotes rule of law, openness, and inclusiveness as a foundation for peace and for prosperity for Japanese diplomacy. Even in today's fragmented world, Japan contributes by providing public goods such as energy security, food supply, humanitarian assistance, and information integrity. This approach applies both to Ukraine's recovery and to engagement to the global south. The newly formed Takaichi administration continues this tradition, but as a new focus on economic security and technological innovation and combined technology and trust as a new foundation of Japan's middle power diplomacy. In other words, Japan will continue to act as quite a stabilizer in an unstable world, not by imposing the power, but by making cooperation work. Yeah, actually, now is a very unstable world, especially by the Trump administration. But Japan provides stability through the consistency. It offers trust, long-term partnerships, and steady voice for the rule and dialogue when others turn inward. And Japan continues our soft powers, including the trust, rule of law, connectivity, stability, cooperation, and inclusiveness. This word is very powerful, I think. Actually, Japan cannot use the military power by the limit of our constitution, but we try to continue use such kind of important words and continue the vision of a HOIP. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Yoko. Maintenant, me tourne vers Amandine. Vous avez la tâche difficile de parler de l'Afrique.
Thank you, Yoko. Now I'd like to give the floor to Amandine. You've got an opportunity to talk about Africa. Does Africa exist? Obviously it does. It's a collection of very different countries, and at the same time we have the impression that Africa is gaining in importance when we look at it in relation to world power. And it would be interesting for you to tell us how you think either Africans or Africa should be seen as a medium power, and in particular, how do you see it in relation to Trump's vision?
Merci beaucoup. Je vais utiliser le privilège de pouvoir
Thank you very much. I'll take advantage of the privilege of speaking French.
Avant d'entrer dans les détails, peut-être
before going into the details of the question of world order and the relationship with Trump's America, I think it would be quite interesting to have some figures so that we can see the scale of Africa's role today when we look at the geopolitical situation. Africa is 30% amount of mineral resources in the world, which makes it impossible for any ecological transition to occur without Africa being involved. You obviously have to use African resources, and the continent accounts for 20% of global population, and that's twice as many people as in Europe. And at the moment, with 1.4 billion people as a market, the African Continental Free Trade Zone is now the largest single market in the world. That was recently signed. And to give you a scale of magnitude, the last figure I can give you is from the United Nations, and Africa currently accounts for 28% of votes at the United Nations General Assembly. So this is not something new. This is a trend which has been developing for a long time. And when we talk about Africa, we're talking about 55 countries. So that's an argument that needs to be heard too. But if we talk about Africa more generally as a continent, you can say that its role could be redefined today in a post-Western scale. You could say that African countries don't want to be passive players or observers. They want to be more active, and that today means with them being given African agency, and we can see this developing for a while now. They want to have a role to play in world governance, and there I see three key elements for that. The first is diversification of partnerships, and once again, this is nothing new, but there's a very simple thing, such as having more and more summit meetings. You've got Africa Plus, Africa Japan, Africa the United States, Africa China, Africa Turkey. You've got all the players who now want to play a role in Africa, and so they're developing their dialogue with the African continent, and they have their summit meetings. And this also shows that the continent has greater geopolitical importance, and it gives it more arguments for having dialogue on an equal basis and with partners who are not just Western or specifically European countries. And this is part of a broader trend for cooperation with bilateral, or you could say it with Africa and the global south. And that's clearly relevant. And you can see this extended to African countries with BRICS Plus, with Egypt and Ethiopia. The second point is the number of African civil servants holding high-level positions in bodies which are very important for worldwide governance. You've got WHO, the WTO, UNESCO, the International Labour Organization. You've got all those bodies with representatives of African countries giving their contribution in the discussions by those organizations. And this is a more dynamic vision, and it's a different culture which comes from African countries and from the leadership of, and brings that to the leadership of the organizations. The third point when you talk about Africa in general is you obviously have to talk about the African Union. And when you talk about the position of Africa in the world order, this is basically through the position taken by the African Union, which is the main institution used by African states for taking up positions for negotiations for climate development, finance, and funding. And you can assess the impact of their partners for migration and the efficiency of humanitarian work. And for Africa, I'd point out there are two key dates which are important. You've got 2022 with Macky Sall as the president of the African Union, who travelled and led negotiations presenting the position of Africa after Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and that was quite a noteworthy event. And the second date is 2023, when the African Union joined G20. So this is important when you look at the role of the African Union. I'd also like to respond to the idea of the shared vision, the common vision. There are lots of points there. You've got the 2063 agenda, the Africa we want, and the position of the African Union on that. And And to pick up on what the fellow panelists said, I would say that the way the African countries can be seen taking up positions is in a regional context. If you look at an international context, that would be in a second state. Perhaps we could exclude South Africa from that. But the idea is to have an influence and to have the ability to secure the regional environment first. And if you look at most of the regional powers in Africa today, you can say that's the case for Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, following these examples of this process. And if you look at medium powers in Africa as full powers, South Africa has its status. There's Nigeria with population of more than 220 million. It's the most highly populated country in Africa, and it will be the most populated after India and China by 2060. And so you can see what the impact of the demographic growth is there. And it's also the head of ECOWAS, which is in Nigeria, the headquarters. And there's also Egypt as a regional power, and it's based on its geostrategical position, its economic strength, and also it is of great diplomatic importance. Egypt has 131 foreign diplomacy missions, which makes it the largest for any African country. And the other medium power is Ethiopia. Well, as you know, it's the headquarters of the African Union that makes it a diplomatic economic hub there, and it's an important interface with outside players. And there's another point which comes up in statements these days, talking about the position of African countries in relation to other partners. It's the country that's never been colonized, and this is a key point when you're dealing with Ethiopia. You've got to see the influence when you look at African countries that want to be decolonized, and this has led to a more open approach with fewer complexes, and with China, Iran, and other countries that are not European countries. And there's another country which I see as important as a medium power, and that's Kenya, and that's obviously based on its key diplomatic position and symbolic influence with the headquarters of the United Nations in Kenya, or one of the main offices of the United Nations there. And it was also the first to have the climate summit meeting in Africa, and that was in 2023 in Kenya. So to conclude, you could see all the common points between these regional powers, and then I'll conclude on some of the points for the relationship to Trump's America. You could say that there's a real need to navigate away in an environment which is complex, uncertain, and very changing, and we can say that there is more division being created. But this is not necessarily a negative point. There can be advantages, but I'd say the main point is that there's diversification of partnerships, but there's not necessarily a clear strategy for the countries concerned. It's a bit of a one-off, case-by-case approach, rather than a coherent policy settlements. And I think that you can see that that's what suits the United States with the Trump approach. Well, it's a less emotional approach that can be seen in French-speaking countries. It's more a deal approach, and you can see this. And there's also the idea of non-alignment, which is a key point in the regional powers that I've cited today. There's no interference and no alignment. And there's a lack of coordination to a certain point in what's happening with the African Union and the regional organizations and for national policies. And I think we can see that that's led a number of states to develop a trend towards coalitions, and depending on interests, there are alliances with players depending on the point of interest at the time, and often a very short-term interest, or I could say an opportunistic interest. And this is okay in a context where multilateralism has become weakened, but there are also coalitions within the regional organizations, and those that don't agree leave the organization. That's what happened with the 3 Sahel countries leaving ECOWAS. And since the 1990s, we've seen that there was a nexus with security and development, and now we have a nexus which is minerals and security, and that can show the way the narrative has changed and how the geopolitical situation can have an influence. And we certainly see this in the relationship with the United States, and there's a very concrete example of that with the position of Donald Trump on the peace agreement between the DRC and Rwanda, whereas the United States are not the first involved in that. Other states failed to do that before. But it's the idea of linking the economy and opportunistic goals, and at the same time the idea of diversifying partners and providing access to minerals, and also looking at the ecological transition. And I'll stop on that point. Thank you.
I'm sorry that we will deprive you from your right to questions, but there is one more point I think we need to make. Under normal circumstances, we would have a seventh interlocutor, presenter, and he couldn't come. And of course, he would represent the viewpoint of not just France, I suppose, but also of Europe. In the way we organized our conversations at Institut Montaigne, it transpired that it is a much more fruitful way of looking at Europe as a collectivity acting as a middle power than each country, especially the big ones among its members that have been accustomed to be treated as major powers. They're not. Economically they are, but politically they're not. And in today's world, Europe is being attacked by three major powers on two fronts. China attacks it economically, Russia attacked it geopolitically, and the United States attacks it both economically and geopolitically. So the challenge is going to be, especially in Amandine's presentation, this desire on the part of Africa, which should be the normal geographical area where Europe's interest ought to be perhaps concentrated, just because of geographical proximity, because of immigration, but also it's the last continent that will grow economically. But the desire for decolonization, non-alignment, and all of those things are challenges that maybe European countries, in terms of their historical relations to that continent, are not yet accustomed to. But those challenges are precisely the kinds of things that the Europeans will have to be thinking about. I'm wondering, and I will leave you the last word, obviously, cher maître. Today's news from the Netherlands, somehow in the horizon there seems to be, or at the end of the tunnel, it may not be the train that's coming your way, and that political orders in European countries or the common sense of their populations may actually lead to a revitalization along democratic lines, and then these issues that are so critical issues can actually be treated with the weight that they deserve. So I'll leave it at that.
Merci beaucoup, Soli.
Thank you very much, Soli. Unfortunately, we can't extend the discussion, but I'm sure we can discuss it in the corridors outside, because there are lots of very exciting and interesting things that were said. Now, my observation of the situation in Europe is that to a certain extent, the challenge that you pointed out there with China, Russia, and the United States is a blessing, you could say, for Europeans, because it's now up to Europeans to stand up again and to take control of things and to open up to others, to stop suffering from a superiority complex, and to go out and find cooperation and collaboration agreements with other players around the world. This was Dino's starting point. it's not just the world of superpowers now, but the world of medium powers. We've got Europeans here, and if we're able to change our mindset and move ahead, we'll be able to have a better environment for existing and cooperating together, structuring a world that won't be caught up in rivalry and conflict that goes on forever. So I would be in favor of that concept of a strong relationship between medium powers in Europe, medium powers from the global south, and it's rather the European Union rather than talking about European powers. As Soli said, it's not just individual countries. And of course, we've got optimism with the Netherlands, but in a number of countries, particularly in large countries, there's still no weakness within the countries, in the country's politics. We're all aware of that. And my hope is that in France, we've had situations where the political situation was far from hopeful. There was the Third Republic in the 19th century and the Fourth Republic after the Second World War. But in both cases, the country managed to stand up again and assert its existence and play an international role. So we trust that that will be the case for all of Europe now. So I would like to express sincere gratitude to all our panelists who were excellent and provided us with very interesting ideas and insights. And we shall now continue the discussions outside in a different format. Thank you.